Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanan. On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Convergence.fm. Today we're going to share a story from a recent product success lab that we did with two co-founders who are in the middle of transforming their business to being more software and AI enabled. Theirs is a traditional business that helps small and medium-sized companies with reducing their purchasing costs. And the two co-founders have built a really trusted relationship with clear separation of responsibilities that I found pretty impressive. One of them has been running the business day to day and growing it steadily, while the other is focused on strategic relationships with customers and partners and thinking about what the big transformative opportunities around the corner for them might be. What stood out to me about their relationship was how complementary the two of them were. One of them thrives on relationships and shaping that big picture, while the other makes sure that the business runs smoothly. This relationship reminds me of the visionary-integrator relationship in the books like Traction and Rocket Fuel. And I think that trust between them can be a real superpower in keeping the company steady while growing, and also what now gives them a ton of confidence to take on the next evolution of their business. Both of them are really energized about how technology and artificial intelligence can help bring more value to their customers and to the market. And they also have trusted relationships with suppliers, their end customers. And what's relevant to this AI world is that they hold a lot of transaction data that flows between the various customers and suppliers. Now, this is the same data that the customers individually have access to, but don't typically find enough value in making sense of it themselves, despite probably having a fairly good hunch that there is value and efficiencies to be gained behind some heavy lifting of the data. The kind of heavy lifting here that's required is about collecting, cleaning, and structuring the data so we can actually trust it and take action based on the insights behind it. Things like handling missing fields, lining up data from different sources and different types of transactions, and transforming it all into something that you can analyze or maybe even train a model on. None of their customers would likely invest that level of work themselves, also because maybe they don't have the sophistication to. But this company that we talked to, I thought was in a really clear position to do so. As part of this shift, they repurposed their team as well as reallocated some of their budget. And in my opinion, invested fairly heavily, something that I respect, despite progress feeling slow. Despite months, almost years of software development, they weren't getting closer to launching something that generated value or even revenue for their customers. And what struck me is that this wasn't because the founders weren't aligned. They definitely were. And they also had a really strong relationship and were relatively clear on their goals. I believe the challenge was that their very strength, their ability to delegate and trust their team, might have turned into a blind spot given the transformative phase that they were in. They stepped back maybe a little bit too far from the messy, hands-on work of shaping a new product. And what they're doing is essentially starting a new business inside the old one. And I don't think you can lead from a distance in those cases. I think you got to be in the weeds again and also develop a really clear sense of what segments of your customers or which of their existing customers would find this new solution most valuable. Maybe who felt the pain most sharply. The question was whether to the customer this problem was just a mild headache that they could live with, or was this a migraine that stopped them in their tracks and they were trying to find a solution for with priority and urgency. I also noticed that the engineering team wasn't working with much structured context from the leaders or feedback. And this started to form a little bit more of an opinion for us on how we could help them. Their development team was getting pretty broad guidance, but then left to sort of figure things out on their own. And frankly, this worked really fine for the level of maturity of their existing business. And the technology was more about maintenance and feature updates versus something more revolutionary. But here in a new venture, that handoff style, I think, can lead to wasted cycles, miscontext. And this development team definitely needs more direct involvement from the founders, even if it's just for a few hours every week, so everyone can stay aligned on what matters most and take things to the customers as soon as possible. Initially, we discussed together the content that we've shared with you in our episode around the most crucial conversations that you probably forgot to have with your team. It aired around April of 2024. And after we got that baseline going, we identified some problems with what was going on in this company. For me, it was a very high cost of development. It was the switching between the owner and the operator hats that the co-founders were playing. And also, I felt like there was much better outcomes from their product team that they could get with just a little bit more involvement on the leaders of the founders' part. On the cost front, this is a small business that was bootstrapped. And at this size, they're basically risking their personal funds at a scale at which they probably wouldn't invest in a startup as, say, a friends and family or angel investor. If they were pitching this idea as a startup, it's unlikely that an investor would put in money without understanding the customer segmentation, the market size, and whether the problem is painful enough and worth solving. But as owners that are also operators, I think they kind of glossed over that without explicitly answering those questions and went straight to building. Now, this is common, okay? I have personally fallen into this trap as an owner. And while I was in the throes of wearing my operator hat as CEO, I've kind of forgotten how an owner or an investor might think about this kind of an investment. So I think it's important to have a sense of that business strategy first, from which we can derive a product roadmap, and that comes from the top. The other problem here with the team is that I think neither of them were actively involved in the product development process anymore. Like they would before for their past version of their business, they provide high-level direction and then kind of walked away expecting that the things that were shipped would lead to outcomes. But in reality, they're in a new phase. They're trying to do something different from within, and it's like starting a company from scratch. And compared to bigger companies, I think they're in a really good spot because both founders are still with the company and they're still very present. And they also were there from the beginning. So they remember what it felt like to start out from nothing, to focus on the fundamentals, like who this thing's for, what it's for, how well does our solution address that who and what, and so forth. And as companies grow, the implied assumptions tend to creep in with, what you might call tribal knowledge, where, especially with a remote team, the communication has to be super, super intentional. And it's really a forcing function for the leaders too, to align on goals and risks and priorities and so forth. By the end of the session here's where we landed. From an operator lens, we went back to the fundamentals. Both founders agreed to model out the new business venture that they would, similar to if they were starting a business today from scratch, and use that angel investment analogy to plan out the next steps and the key questions to be answered. The co-founder that was more in charge of strategy and big relationships would start to articulate the idea and the customer lens and his value proposition. And the other co-founder, who was more operationally minded, would provide guidelines for what it would take to operate that at various stages of maturity and what kind of investment they both would align on. From a product thinking lens, we arrived at two key actions. First, let's take this business roadmap and then marry it and align it with the technology needs and opportunities to come up with a roadmap. From there, let's identify critical assumptions in this roadmap or strategy and run some fast experiments. For example, let's assume a subset of their existing customers would find this product valuable enough that they might be solving it already, and then test it. For example, we could go talk to some of their existing customers who are within an arm's reach that'll pick up the phone with them and figure out amongst their hunches, who would be first in line to buy this new finished product. We could again have these conversations with them and ask them open-ended questions about whether they knew this problem existed and to what extent, understand what level of investment or priority they've already applied to trying to solve it so far, and how often it might come up in leadership discussions today, and so on. And these super quick and low cost conversations can help these founders in terms of sizing the problem, identifying the right customer segments to target first, and then prioritize the next set of assumptions that they can go run tests and then allocate capital appropriately. Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. Why the braids? Maybe they look cute, but really, it's because I'm finally getting a haircut. I'm donating this hair to Crowns of Courage, an incredible group that makes wigs for kids going through cancer. I know how much hair can be such a big part of making someone feel confident and more like themselves. And this is a way that we can help a child feel like that, especially during such a hard time. On top of that, I'm also matching donations to the Children's Foundation here in Michigan. The foundation funds health and wellness programs for kids in underserved communities, and I've gotten to see firsthand how thoughtful and impactful their work is. This is where you folks in my community can help. If you donate, whether it's a 20, 50, whatever feels right, I'm going to match it. So your gift is going to go twice as far. Whether it's because cancer has touched your life or you find meaning in helping kids feel whole again, here's an opportunity to double that impact. Thank you so much for your support here. Another thing we aligned on was getting way more intentional with the engineering team. Now, not micromanagement, providing more explicit and intentional context and content, as well as closer involvement in terms of looking at the reviewed work that was done, providing feedback, sharing business strategy, milestones, and how this technology really flows upstream into that. It's just a few hours, I think, that this could take, whether leaders join weekly planning, product demos, retrospectives, and 4 to 5 hours a week could really short circuit and reset the communication, drive more alignment with the team, and improve the flow of information both ways for the early stage of this venture. And this is, I think, valuable, even if it means realizing that you need to reduce your software development capacity initially, and is much better than building additional features that you don't know that customers need. Feature bloat is not only expensive to maintain, but can also have your customers feel like they're overpaying if they only want a subset of what you're charging them for. And then the final thing we talked about was maturing their use of AI. On the development front, we noticed that they could use copilots a lot more. So we recommended enabling that from a budget standpoint, from a training standpoint. And then given that this is a real data-driven solution, we feel like there's ways to test out how LLMs and generative AI can help. We agreed that generic LLMs can be used in the early experiments to test how much value the data really holds before investing in full-scale development, custom models, or integration. And we showed them safe ways to do this without compromising confidentiality or security of their business or any of their customers. In summary, I think there's a number of things why I'm excited and feel optimistic about this company. They've got a lot of the pieces in play already, like two founders who already trust each other and know how to play together. They've also got direct access to customers who will answer their phone calls and be candid and tell them the truth. And their team, I think, is small enough that they can pivot pretty quickly. Most importantly, I think both founders acknowledged that the change needed to start with themselves before they can change the organization. And I think that kind of self-awareness is rare and can go a really long way in de-risking a transformation. This type of transformation is one where they're solving for a similar need for their customer, but with a new set of skills and tools that they need to develop in-house. This kind of pivot is kind of like when Netflix transitioned from shipping movies to your house in DVDs to streaming it through the internet directly to your TV. And that kind of transition requires leadership commitment, and I love that both co-founders here are fully committed to it. The work ahead, I don't think, is as much about building more software as much as it is at first slowing down, asking the right questions of themselves, their customers, and their team. And only once that's all synthesized into a strategy to move faster and adding fuel to that, once we understand what matters the most. With that discipline, I think this company has a real shot at transforming themselves and showing how small and mid-sized businesses can really compete in a world powered by data and AI and gigantic investments flowing into this space. If any of you are invested in diving deeper into some of the ideas that we touched on today, here's a few books that you might have already heard me recommend on the show. The Goal by Eli Goldratt for learning how to spot and resolving bottlenecks through the theory of constraints is one. In this case, I think that kind of thinking really helped identify which assumptions were the most critical constraints and which experiments to test and prioritize first. The Mom Test by Rob Fitzpatrick is another book. It's for practical guidance on how to run customer discovery conversations without, say, leading the witness. I think this thinking will help them a lot when they talk to their customers to validate this new strategy that they've ideated. Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore is another oldie but goodie book, and it's for understanding technology adoption curves and how to find the right entry point in the market. And I think as they talk to their customers, this is going to be really helpful in identifying where their various customers are and who to target first and who to demo or sell to first. And the last book is 7 Powers by Hamilton Helmer. And it's got frameworks on how companies build durable advantage over time, including the same need, different skill type of innovation that we talked about. He talks about all the quadrants and a lot of different ways that companies can innovate from within. Well, I hope you enjoyed a summary of this recent product success lab that we did. If you're interested in doing one similar, send us a note on our website or through our social media DMs if you want to nerd out with our team here. We will be back next week on Convergence with more conversations on fostering engaged teams and building delightful products. We'll see you then. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.